of 2023. Thank you for remembering that. This is our last session for 2022 before we go into 2023. And we'll be taking a look at if we did we cover everything? Have we answered all of our questions for now anyway, before we move forward with the conservation plan development? But that's actually starting now as well. And we'll be looking for your input also on how we can make that conservation plan a piece that you can use and refer to and that can be active for you. So today's session is going to be shorter. We're going to skip some of the introductory messaging, assuming that a lot of you have been on before and you're familiar with who we are and what we do. So we'll do a short one for you, but then we'll move on through. For those of you for translation, we do have translation. So use the globe in your toolbox, in your toolbar, and select the translation. If you need Spanish translation, we have the company Parler. It's Italian, and I don't speak Italian, so I'm sure it's pronounced differently. But Christian and Monica are on to help you throughout this session. So thanks so much to them for their work and for their support. We've been working with this group for a while now, and they've been a great big help in a number of our programs.
Susan, can we remind folks that if you're an English speaker, it's also great to put the English translation on so that we can have Spanish participation that's just as fluid?
Yes, definitely. Thanks, Jacqueline, for that reminder.
Great. Okay. Yeah. So everyone turn your translation on.
Yeah. Okay. And then, of course, our schedule is going to be about the same today as it was on our last session on wintering grounds. So today we'll be talking about hummingbirds and where they are, the conservation plan, just briefly, our vision, and then moving into some presentations that we have for you before going into the analysis of threats and that processing that Jacqueline will then lead. If you have any questions and you haven't participated before, and if that's making you feel lost, go on and put something in the chat box and we'll help you out, or we'll explain more in the discussion here. But a lot of the names look familiar, so I'm thinking that most people have been on. And yes, thanks. I see a note that somebody might have to leave early, but appreciate your comments, and hopefully you can, send in your information later if you have some thoughts. I want to say a big thanks to Greg Butcher. Greg is with the U.S. Forest Service International Programs, and he's been a huge reason why the WHP is successful. He's been supporting it for the last, how many years, Greg?
11.
11 years. Yeah. So a long time. But Greg is retiring. So actually his party is tomorrow. Can I invite everybody, Greg?
Sure. Oh,
okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Head to DC. The party will be at the Forest Service International Programs Office, right? And I personally want to say a big thanks to Greg. I've been working with Greg since, goodness, Greg, forever, just for a long time.
Well, we've known each other at least 30 years.
Oh, yeah, I know. It's amazing, isn't it? Was I ever that young? Yeah. So, Greg, thank you so much for bringing this program to this point. And you're not done yet, so you have until the end of the month, and we're going to keep you busy. A big thanks to Greg.
So Western Hummingbird Partnership has been one of the favorite things I've done in my job here at Forest Service. And I'm really excited by this conservation planning process because it brought so many new people to the table. And I know under Sue's excellent leadership, she'll find a way to keep you all involved in doing good things for hummingbirds long after I'm retired. And you see that picture there, that's what I'm going to do after I'm retired, is lots more bird watching. So I plan to wear out that pair of binoculars and any vehicles that are taking me to see good birds. So hope to see you all in the field. And don't be strangers. If you can't find my personal email, Sue will have it, and love to be in touch with all of you after I retire.
Thanks, Greg. Now we're going to put you through your paces one more time here.
All right. So the Western Hummingbird partnership started before I did, so it's more like 13 or 14 years old than just the 11 I've been with it. But we have a strong advisory committee, and really pleased to have the people on the right on the advisory committee representing U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management, Point Blue Conservation Science, Canadian Wildlife Service, although they call themselves more Environment and Climate Change Canada, Klamath Bird Observatory, Environment for the Americas, and thanks for this. Oh, and the fancy thing is University of Guadalajara, Caxur, and Sarah, he has been just a really great leader for the Mexican team, and looking forward to the growth of that team in all places. And we would like to add one person more from Canada and one person more from Mexico. So if you're interested in serving on this advisory committee, please let Sue know, and we can grow in that direction. Next. So we have a couple of visions for Western migratory hummingbirds, a short one, which is just a future with thriving populations of Western hummingbirds, and a little more detail. Because of our shared passion for hummingbirds, we envision international cooperation to increase public support for thriving hummingbird populations in healthy environments for birds and human communities. So take the short one or the long one. It's been a fun ride, and I know everyone's going to keep doing good things for hummingbirds. Next. So one of the great things we have at Western Hummingbird Partnership is a really good website with all kinds of great information about hummingbird conservation. And so I hope you'll all go visit the website in English or in Spanish. And one of the really cool things we have on there is we have flower guides, plant guides for all the regions of the Western United States. And so there's some, if you want to know what plants hummingbirds use, you can find that on the WHP website amid all kinds of other great information as well. Next. So I've been in some planning, conservation planning actions where it took forever to get the plan done, and nothing happened to it after it was done. But the fun about doing this conservation plan with the Western Hummingbird Partnership is that we all drew blood and committed to promoting an action plan that will follow this conservation plan, facilitate working groups, which will be divided up by as suggested by the plan, update the plan regularly. I hope it will be every year. Provide updates on conservation plan progress. So you will all be on the mailing list, email list for Western Hummingbird Partnership, and should expect to hear from us periodically on how we're doing on this plan. The Environment for the Americas has been really good with communication about hummingbirds. So if you're not getting regular communications from Sue or her team, be sure to get in touch with her and get on the mailing list. And we already have some money dedicated for collaborative conservation projects, especially in Mexico, but those will roll out next year as it's clear what we want to do because of this planning. Next. So it's super important what we're doing here because 3 billion birds have been lost since 1970. It's an inauspicious time for me to retire because I obviously have not done my job very well. And you're all going to have to do better than I did because we cannot afford to lose another 3 billion birds in the next 50 years. And that's 25% of the birds in the United States and Canada. So it's way too many to lose. And unfortunately, several of the hummingbird species that we're working with are part of the 3 billion birds lost. So I think we're going to go into that in a little more detail. But unfortunately, hummingbirds are not the exception to the rule, but are part of this trend that we all need to work together to reverse. Next. So this is the scope of our plan. It's all the Western hummingbirds. Anna's hummingbird is included, even though it's been increasing in range and population. We're concerned about whether that will continue, and we're interested in the possibility that the Anna's hummingbird increase has been related to the decline of some of these other species. So with that, Sue, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Great. Thanks, Greg. And what we're going to share now is just the maps again, which we shared at the last two sessions, showing the ranges of the hummingbirds that we're focusing on. And as we said before, we've already talked about threats to hummingbirds on their breeding grounds. We've talked about threats to hummingbirds on their non-breeding grounds. And what we want to focus on today is those threats that they might face when they're on migration. So this is the area in yellow on the bottom map. And then I just wanted to share this other map that's been developed recently. They just came out in November, but they show a little bit more detail about some of the migration and breeding and non-breeding areas for the species. And so it's kind of a fun, different look, although the overall information is about the same. So, Rufous hummingbird breeds north and then migrates to Mexico. And you can see the general area of migration again in that yellow section on the map. And I think we are all aware that it's particularly challenging to learn about threats to hummingbirds on migration. They're small, they're hard to track. We can't use some of the wonderful new tools that are coming out, like, satellite tracking. They're also difficult to identify as they fly by quickly. They don't sing. So there are a lot of challenges to being able to identify hummingbirds and to track them as they move. So this will be an exciting session to have today to consider what those factors might be, considering that we may not have a whole lot of information, particularly where we don't have, say, established bird banders and other research sites. Allen's hummingbird has one of the most restricted ranges of hummingbirds. You can see that here, where it's a Pacific West species with migration along the western U.S. and then into a small area of Mexico. And then Calliope hummingbird, of course, follows the Rocky Mountain and Pacific flyways on migration, and again, a far north breeder and a overwintering in western Mexico. And broad-tailed, we're excited to have today David Inouye talking. I'm expecting, David, that you'll be talking about broad-tailed hummingbirds, so I'm not going to say too much about ranges here. And we have Sarayi Contreras and other partners from Mexico on who can speak to some of the research that's been learned about their arrivals into Mexico. And then, of course, the Anna's hummingbird with large numbers that are present in southern Arizona from July to October. And also with its range expansion that's been happening and which we've discussed in prior sessions. And finally, Costa's hummingbird, which is a resident of Southern California and Southwestern Arizona, but then of course it moves between breeding sites in Northern California and east to central Arizona. And our black-chinned hummingbird, which migrates to southern states, some along the Gulf of Mexico. So, we're considering these areas where they're supposedly migrating and looking at what kind of factors might threaten them along the way. And of course, with all of these different hummingbirds, these routes might not be as specific as they look on a map, so they might be more dispersed. And I think what we're going to see next with our first guest speaker today is going to be really eye-opening in terms of learning more about migrations of hummingbirds and then using that information to determine, what some of those threats might be. So I'd like to introduce Melanie Smith with the Audubon Society. Melanie, are you there?
Hi, yes, I'm here.
Okay, great. I'm going to remove the spotlight from Greg, and I'm going to pull down my screen and let you share yours.
All right. Hi, everybody. Now, you're seeing a map of North America?
Yes, we are.
Yes.
Okay, great. So hi, I work for the National Audubon Society, and I work for our Migratory Bird Initiative, and this is the Bird Migration Explorer. So Sue invited me here today to show you what we've done and give you an example for hummingbirds. So if you haven't seen this tool yet, it's new. We published it in September, and it includes 458 migratory species. These are the regularly occurring species of the US and Canada, and then we're tracking them throughout their full annual cycle. So you can look up a species in this bird species panel. You could look them up by group or other types of ways of filtering. So, here are the hummingbirds that are included. And today we'll look up the rufous hummingbird. So then this takes me to a map of the full annual cycle for this species. And if we had tracking data for the species, this is where you would see it. We don't have tracking data for hummingbirds. So what we do have are the eBird status models and seasonal ranges. So the seasonal ranges are in the background in green and blue. This is a product that we produced based on eBird data, BirdLife International data, and up in the Arctic, some Audubon Alaska data. And then we have the eBird status models are summarized into these brown dots. So at the bottom of the map here, I can control the timeline. I can play and pause, and I can drag this slider forward and back. So if I zoom in here, these hexagon boundaries appear. So what we're doing is we're taking 3 kilometer pixels and we are summarizing them up into these bigger hexagon bins. And when we do that, we're summarizing the abundance of birds. And over here in the legend in the top right, you can see that we've categorized them from very low to very high. Each of these classes sums up to 20% of the individuals. So if you were to take all of the very high hexagons here, those combined would be where the 20% densest distribution of rufous hummingbirds are this week of the year. If you zoom in farther, you get to a finer resolution of the data. These are 50 kilometer hexagons. So I'll zoom back out now and can just click play and let you see sort of how they're changing distribution week by week. You'll notice this doesn't explicitly have a migration range mapped like you saw in some of those other maps. We're really letting the eBird models sort of show us how they get in between the breeding and non-breeding areas. All right, so the next piece is the species connections map. And this is where we take all of the re-encounter records we have for a species and let you explore how places are connected through those data. And for rufous hummingbirds, so for rufous hummingbirds, we're only going to have band recoveries, but for other species, you might have GPS tracks, you might have MODIS, you might have genoscape data. So these are band recoveries, and this map really caught our eye. And we had a lot of conversation about it because the majority of the re-encounters are outside of their typical range. And what we think is going on, we think these data are accurate, but this is because of passionate banders of vagrant hummingbirds. This is what we think is going on. And whenever someone sees a rufous hummingbird where it sort of doesn't belong, they capture it, they band it, and a lot of people are out looking for it. So we think that's what's going on over here. Okay, so then the third kind of map is called conservation challenges. And this is where we're taking the distribution of a species and the footprint of some type of human use or environmental change, and we're intersecting those two things to look for co-occurrence. And co-occurrence we call exposure. We're using those two terms interchangeably. So here I'll select suburban areas. And then this will start playing over the course of the year, the distribution of Rufous hummingbird in suburban areas. And what you're seeing, the size of the circles is the same exact thing you saw on the other map. And now we've also introduced color. And so the color is telling us how many of those birds are co-occurring with suburban areas. So let me just pause when we get to this high spot in the fall. So this, you can see at the bottom of the screen which time of year they have on average the highest exposure. That's in the fall. At that time, they're down in Mexico. A lot of them are around Mexico City, where we're seeing these very high exposure levels and very high abundance levels. And I'll just zoom in and let you see what it looks like at that finer resolution. Okay, so in the Bird Migration Explorer, we have 19 different conservation challenges that we've mapped. And these are not all of the things that are important potential threats, but they are the ones that we were able to map at a hemispheric extent. So we have 19 of these. And I'm just going to let you take a look and see what those are. And not every one of these is relevant to every species. So we didn't, sort of in the background, we took every species distribution week by week, and we took every conservation challenge footprint, and we intersected those and did all of the calculations. But in the front end, we're not showing every single one of those combinations because they're not all relevant. So what we needed was a matrix to help us surface the relevant combinations of species. So here's a slide that summarizes that. So we're taking the footprint of the challenge. We're taking the weekly eBird models and overlaying them. And then that gives us the proportion of birds in each hexagon that are co-occurring with that challenge. Then we push that through this matrix that shows us the relevance of each challenge to each species. And therefore, the Explorer is surfacing only challenges that are marked relevant to the species. So then the next step is to show you this matrix. And here we have your 7 focal species. We have the 19 challenges, and where there is a 1, those are what we marked as relevant. And this is like flipping a switch on the front end. You know, we can go and turn these on and off as needed. And so Nat Seavey and I were really excited when we were contacted by Sue and Greg about this, because if you all are interested in reviewing and helping update this matrix to improve it, we would love it. That would be great. In fact, the matrix, we know there's room for improvement. The process here was we initially hired a consultant on the wing to do a lit review, and for 458 species and 80 different threats, find those relevant combinations. And then, of course, not every species and every threat type have ever even been studied or documented in the literature. And so then we had to extrapolate from what we know. So we might learn that, you might see a paper that tells you that ruby-throated hummingbirds are prone to building collisions. And then you might say, if that's true for ruby-throated hummingbirds, it's probably true for all hummingbirds. And so we're going to mark them all as relevant. So there are a lot of decisions to be made. And it's of course imperfect information. We all know that we don't all know. We all know that we don't know everything about this, right? So just one more layer of detail here, sort of how did we get to these scores? They all have a record where, so we're gonna use this Allen's Hummingbird highlighted in yellow as our example. So low density suburban development, mortality, and the literature identified that as an impact. And then we go over here and we have the quote from the literature, and then we have the name of the paper. So in this case, it's telling us other taxa, particularly the hummingbirds and swifts and warblers, appear especially vulnerable to building collisions, with more than one species ranking in the overall high vulnerability list. So based on that record, you could, mark all these hummingbird species as relevant to suburban development and urban development, because those are the places where building collisions are happening.
Melanie, let me just take a minute. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we might be having some challenges with the translation. So in the chat box, those of you who are using translation, can you let me know if that's working for you? Sorry, is translation working?
Todavía no la tenía, sorry. No estaba poniendo atención en la traducción.
I'm hearing it now, Susan.
Okay, great. Thanks. All right, then we'll let you carry on, Melanie.
Okay, yeah, and actually that was that's really all I wanted to say about the matrix, but I importantly forgot to mention to you that the Bird Migration Explorer there's an entire mirror of this clone of this site that's in Spanish. So you can get to that by, there's this upper right menu, and you can choose Spanish here, or the Spanish name of the product is called Exploraves. So if you go to exploraves.org, that's the Spanish site. I think that's all I have, and I don't know, Sue, if there was time built in for questions or discussion. I'll just turn it back over to you.
Yeah, typically we've waited to the end, but I think today, since we have 3 speakers today, we'll just go on and do maybe 2 to 3 minutes of questions. Does anybody have a question they'd like to ask? You can either put it in the chat box, or you can come on, unmute and ask your question live.
I have a question. I don't know whether Melanie knows the answer, but maybe somebody else in the meeting does. I'm curious how many people are banding hummingbirds in the US. I think there are only like 3 in Colorado, but I was a little surprised at how well you were picking up those birds outside the major range, those rufous hummingbirds. So there must be a moderate number of people banding them.
I think Simon English might have the latest, greatest data on that. Simon, do you have a number?
Sorry about that. Currently banding, I'm not absolutely certain. I only have data up until the last, that would be 2021. And in Colorado specifically, I think, Sue, you and I talked about this. I think I said there were 6 people contribute, or 6 stations rather, that were contributing data on a regular basis.
Yeah.
In the US, using the same, like there's some filtering criteria that I can tell you more about if you're interested, but throughout the US, there was something like 250 to 300 stations. And that's not uniformly distributed throughout the US, but yeah, concentrated in some regions and less so in the central US.
I could address that. as I am one of those banders.
Great.
There are 3 of us in Tennessee. There are 4 in Alabama. There are about that many in Louisiana. There are 2 in Mississippi, a couple in Florida, a couple in Georgia, 3 in Pennsylvania. There's a couple gentlemen that cover the Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia corridor. But we have a listserv, and I have that complete list if anybody's interested in it.
We'd actually love to have that list. That would be a big help.
Okay, I'll get it to you. And the states that they are licensed to band in.
Okay, wonderful.
I
We have a-
just wanted to confirm Melanie's hunch, because I know that these hummingbird banders east of the Mississippi are really well organized, and they keep their eye out for reports of Western hummingbirds or Southern hummingbirds in the east. And you can usually get a hummingbird banded within 24 hours of its public reporting. It's a very efficient team and very dedicated.
Thanks, Greg. Question, I'll do this as the last question. Is most of the data coming from eBird birding reports?
That's a great question. Okay, so we have a few different kinds of data. eBird is one of the major sources. And we're using the eBird status models. So those are built using the checklists as the input. So if you put checklists into eBird, those get used in the modeling process. The models get used in the Bird Migration Explorer. Then we have connectivity data. So millions of band records. I don't know, hundreds of thousands of MODIS re-encounters, and as well as Genoscape connections. And then we have tracking data. The tracking data don't come in one big delivery like, the Bird Banding Lab data set does. They are held by hundreds of different owners of those data. So part of this process was collaborating with every individual tracking data holder, inviting them to contribute. And we ended up with tracking data for 184 species and 9,300 individual tracked birds. That's what we have so far. And this system, we will keep updating it. We'll keep pulling down new eBird models, every year's update of BBL, MODIS, all of those, MoveBank, pulling tracks down off of MoveBank. So there are lots of data sources. eBird is a really big one. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Melanie. I appreciate your coming on again. It's wonderful to see the map, and I know everybody's excited about it.
Yeah, great to have a chance to talk to you all. And if you have other questions after this, you can feel free to write me. You can write migratory-birds@audubon.org.
Okay.
Or melanie.smith@audubon.org. Yeah.
I'll put together a list from the chat and send them over to you, and then send them out to the participants.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Our next speaker is David Inouye, and David is down in Colorado, in our neck of the woods. So David, it's great to have you. Trying to find your photo here so I can spotlight you. There you are. I've had the great privilege of being able to go to David's amazing cabin in Crested Butte and watch his hummingbird work. So if you ever have a chance to do that, David, I just invited a whole bunch of people to your house.
Be happy to have the help banding.
There you go. All right.
Okay, so I thought what I would talk about is what are the floral resources that are available for migratory hummingbird species that we encounter at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. Let's see.
Yeah, I was going to see if you could hit that slide start and put it in full.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
So here's the species that is a resident breeding species at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, the broadtails. And you can see this one's been visiting flowers. It's got lots of pollen under its chin. And actually, you can also see here the wing slot that makes the wing whistle that's characteristic of the male broad-tailed hummingbirds. So where I work is in the during the summer is the West Elk Mountains. Here's Crested Butte, Colorado, which some of you may know if you're skiers. This is Gothic Mountain, and on the backside from this view of Gothic Mountain is the East River Valley, and that's where I've spent summers since 1971 doing research at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. The biological lab's up at 2,900 meters, about 9,500 feet. And during the summer, it's a very busy place. There are 180 people and residents there during the summer, coming from all over the country and some internationally, a mixture of students, of principal investigators like me, postdocs, graduate students, research assistants. This time of year, the population is much smaller, down to maybe about 6 people for the winter, and the road is not kept open, so you have to ski to get in and out. This is a former mining town back in the 1880s, but now a hub of activity for ecologists. I just popped this and the next slide in since we started this morning, because it occurred to me that I might say something about diurnal migration as well as the seasonal migrations that we've been talking about. So several years ago, I was able to put radios on some male broad-tailed hummingbirds, and I was trying to answer the question, where do male broadtails go for the night? And this was a question that was inspired by work by Bill Calder from the University of Arizona, who used to work here at the biological lab. And he had noticed that he heard that males going uphill at dusk, and he would go up a little bit higher each night on the mountain to try and see if he could still hear them flying overhead. And he never did figure out how high they were going or where they were spending the night. And I have one data point, which was a male that carried a radio up to 10,624 feet, having been banded down here by my cabin in the lower right part of the picture at about 9,500 feet. And it dropped the radio. The radio came off up here, but I was able to track the radio down. And then I went back the next year with a transect of data loggers to measure temperatures to figure out how cold did it get at different altitudes. So down here by the river, the lowest temperature during a 4-day interval during, in this case, 1st to the 4th of July, was about 28.5 degrees. Up at the elevation where I found the radio, it was about 43 degrees. And if you continued to go higher up, it then got colder. So my one data point suggests that the male broadtails are going up to spend the night at the warmest altitude in that East River Valley, where there's a lot of cold air drainage at night. So there's a local diurnal migration on the part of the males. I'll talk about the females in a little bit later, but they're spending the night on their nests down at the bottom of the valley. So since 1973, I've been working on a project looking at the flowering phenology and the flowering abundance of wildflowers here. And what we've been able to find out is that the global climate has an influence, or regional climate, including the North Pacific Oscillation, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, and the quasi-biennial oscillation. All those climate factors affect the phenology of migration of the hummingbirds. They also affect our climate in the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, the local climate. So those global and regional influences determine what's the snowpack in the winter, when does the snow melt in the spring, how much rain do we get, what's the temperature, and those variables also influence the phenology of emergence, both of some of the pollinators like bumblebee queens when they emerge in the spring and when the flowers that they visit emerge. And so we have a lot of data now for about 140 species, I think, of wildflowers of what their flowering phenology is like and how many flowers they make. And those data come from 34 2x2 meter plots that we count 3 times a week, every flower in all those plots. And so here's one of those plots very early in the season. There's still some snow around, and in fact, remains of an avalanche from the previous winter, broken pieces of trees. You can see some of the buds of the first flowers to bloom or the second flower to bloom, the glacial lilies, I'll come back to in a minute, the yellow buds in the background, and a few flowers of the first flower to bloom, the spring beauty. So the first thing to flower in the spring is the spring beauty, Claytonia, and then that's followed by the willows, and then the glacial lilies, and then the small larkspur. And these two, actually these three, the willow, the erythronium, the glacial lilies, and the larkspur, the delphinium, are all important floral resources for the hummingbirds when they first arrive. But we're also monitoring bee populations. We have 15 years of data for the 140 or so species of native bees in the area. And we also have some data for the butterflies and then for the hummingbirds as well. And then one of the last species to flower at the end of the summer in this phenological clock are the gentians. But they're not quite so important for the hummingbirds because usually the hummingbirds are leaving by that time of year. So as I mentioned, the broadtails are the resident breeding population, and they make a lot of use of this early larkspur, also competing with bumblebee queens that are visiting them. We also have 2 species that come through as post-breeding migrants, the rufous and the calliope. All 3 of those, plus the black-chin that I work with at my lower altitude winter home, were on that list of threatened hummingbird species that we saw at the beginning of this session. So this is the glacial lily flower, Erythronium grandiflorum, very pretty wildflower early in the spring, the second thing to bloom, and there can be quite dense populations or patches of that glacial lily as shown in this picture. And they are visited by hummingbirds. Here's a broadtail male visiting the flower, but they are not good pollinators of this flower. The hummingbirds are not a good match. You can see the bird's putting its bill in here at the top of the flower and not coming into contact with the anthers and the stigma. So I think almost all of the pollination of those flowers is by bumblebee queens, but it is an important nectar resource for the broadtails. It's really the first flower that they can visit when they arrive at this altitude. So the flowering, the date of year when we see the first flowers is impacted by snowpack and snowmelt. So here, for instance, is a plot of how much snow is left on the ground at the biological lab on the 30th of April, and it can be up to almost 2 meters of snow still there at that time of year. Other years, it may be all gone by the 30th of April. But the more snow there is, the later the first flowering dates are. And then also plotted here, the red data points are the arrival dates of the first male broad-tailed hummingbird at the Rocky Mount Biological Lab. And those data come from a friend, Billy Barr, who's worked there almost as long as I have and has recorded since the early 70s observations on things like when did he see the first or hear the first broad-tailed male in the spring, or when did he see the first marmot emerging from hibernation. So 2 important takeaway points here. One is that snowpack and snowmelt dates influence phenology very strongly, both of the flowering plants and of the pollinators that visit those plants. And a second take-home message is that the slopes of those lines are not parallel, which means that they're not responding in the same way to these changing temporal cues of snowpack disappearance or snowmelt dates. So there's the potential in the future for mismatch between the flowering dates by the plants and the arrival dates of the hummingbirds. And because the hummingbirds are not responding as strongly to those changes in phenology, they may eventually start arriving at the site after most of those flowers are finished blooming for the year. So here are the data across years for the date of the first hummingbird, and you can see that they are getting earlier. So there must be some climate variable that is influencing the arrival dates of the hummingbirds. Probably cues that they're getting somewhere on their overwintering grounds that it's time to head, and then the migration is either sped up or slowed down by the climate conditions that they are encountering along that migration route. So let me say a little bit about the second important nectar resource for these hummingbirds, which is the early larkspur species, Delphinium natalianum. And it too can have very dense populations to the degree that perhaps pollinators are limiting for when you have that many flowers. I've kept track since 1991 in a couple of permanent plots of the total number of flowering plants of that larkspur. Here's a picture of a bumblebee queen coming in to visit one of them. Or you can see that there's a huge amount of variation from year to year in how many flowers are available. In some years, there are very few of those larkspur flowers available. Also, in addition to the number of flowering plants, I've counted the flowers on those plants. So I have an idea of how many flowers are available on those flower stalks. And the number of flowers per stalk is strongly influenced by how much snow we got the previous winter. The more snow we get, the more flowers there are per stalk, and also the more plants producing flowers. And despite decades of trying to figure this out, the causation behind this correlation, I have not yet succeeded. So I don't know why it is that the more snow there is, the more flowers there are the next spring, but somehow that correlation is generated. And then over years, because we are getting, on average, less snow per winter than we used to, the average number of flowers per inflorescence is declining. And that's, of course, of concern if you're worried about how many flowers are available for either the bees or the hummingbirds to collect nectar from. Another thing that's been changing is related to bud abortion. So here at the top of an early inflorescence, these are some aborted buds, and almost every flower stalk has one or more of those aborted buds that are not going to develop into flowers as these well-developed larger purple buds are going to. And the percentage of buds that are aborted is higher in years of earlier snow melt. And because the trend over years now is that snow melt is happening earlier and earlier, there's a higher proportion of buds being aborted to the point where maybe about on average 40% of the buds are being aborted in years of early snow melt if we don't have much snow the previous winter. So that may also influence the availability of nectar resources for migrating, these breeding migratory hummingbirds. A later flowering species of larkspurs, Delphinium barbii, and many of the correlations that I talked about here are also influencing Delphinium barbii, which is an important floral resource for, in this case, a female broad-tailed hummingbird visiting one of those flowers. Other floral resources that we're keeping track of are the Castanea, the Indian paintbrush flowers. This one, the Aquilegia canadensis, is actually not in any of our phenology plots, so we don't have good data on variation in its phenology or abundance, but we do know that it's being visited by the hummingbirds. You can see the nice dusting of yellow pollen on the chin of that female broad-tailed hummingbird. So these floral resource metrics of how many flowers are available and when they're available during the summer are changing divergently, and also divergently for different pollinator species. The bees, 140 or so species of bees that we're keeping track of, and the 3 species of hummingbirds we're keeping track of. Also the butterflies and moths and flies. In addition to flowers, another potentially important resource is aquatic insects. And one of the other biologists at the Rocky Mount Biological Lab is Dr. Brad Taylor from North Carolina State University. If you have a keen eye, maybe you've already noticed the hummingbird sitting on a nest on this tree next to the East River. And Brad had told me that in his wanderings around the East River and its tributaries, which he walks up and down every summer on a regular basis, he'd often notice that there were hummingbirds nesting on branches over the trees. And here's a close-up of where that nest was and of the female sitting on that nest. And I'm sorry to report that a couple of weeks later, a crow found that nest and apparently ate the nestlings. And I'm a little concerned that my presence photographing around that nest may have cued in the crow. So I'm feeling a little bit guilty about that loss. This may have actually been a second nesting attempt because this was in early August when she was still incubating. And Brad is now doing an analysis of the lipid content of some hummingbird tissues that we were able to provide him in order to find out how important to their diet are the fatty acids coming from aquatic stream insects. And so it may be for a couple of reasons that females would be nesting over the streams. One might be protection from some of the predators that might try and approach a nest on the ground. Another is that it may be a little bit warmer at night right over the stream. And so I have some data now on the temperature, the nocturnal temperatures of these females nesting to compare to where the males are roosting at night. And then this may also provide them easy access to the insect swarms over the river. And in fact, Brad found this nest this summer because he saw the female hawking insects nearby over the East River. So the area where I'm working is a hot spot in terms of global warming. Here's a map from a Washington Post newspaper article a year or two ago showing this hot spot, and we're working right down here in this part of Colorado. And there are a number of aspects of the climate that are changing. I've been doing an analysis of the Crested Butte weather station data that go back to about 1909. And if you look at the number of rainy days, that's changing, particularly since the late 80s, early 90s. There's a very steep slope to that line. So the summers are getting drier, and that's not good news for the wildflower resources. The maximum number of days with no rain seems to be on an increasing trend, matching now maybe what it was back in the 1930s. And all these climate variables, there's a huge amount of variation. Some of these outliers could be related to the reliability of the weather instruments that were used 100 years ago. But I think there's an undeniable trend towards longer runs of days with no precipitation. And we're seeing more variability. So if you look at the variation in rain per rainy day, measured as the coefficient of variation, we're seeing more variation among days in that event. And that's one prediction of some models, many models, I guess, of climate change on the weather, is the weather's going to be becoming more variable. In terms of snowmelt date, the date of the first bare ground is a very important factor for phenology, because that determines when the ground is bare and plant growth begins, flowering begins, and the ground starts to warm up. So bees that are spending the winter underground warm up. And this is also important for the migratory species like hummingbirds. And there's a huge amount of variation. Those snowmelt dates have been as early as the 23rd of April and as late as the 19th of June during the years that I've been working out there. But a trend, marginally significant trend towards earlier snowmelt dates. I can look at snowfall, which has been measured back since the mid-70s by my friend Billy Barr. Those are the green data, and then estimated snowfall dates back to the 1930s using data from a stream gauge on the East River at Almont, Colorado. And so it looks like despite all that variation, there's an undeniable trend towards lower snowfall. And that, for instance, is going to influence both the timing of flowering of the larkspur flowers and also the abundance of those larkspur flowers. I've been collaborating with a biologist named Cassie Stoddard, faculty member at Princeton University for about the last 5 or 6 years. And she's been interested in hummingbird behavior and their responses to different frequencies of light. And so I've been banding birds and we're also putting pit tags, gluing pit tags. This is an older model of pit tag, which was about twice the size of the ones that we're using now. And then she has antennas on the feeders so she can keep track of which individual birds are coming in to her different experimental feeders. And I'll stop there. That's some information about the long-term data that we're collecting both on hummingbirds and the floral resources they need at the biological lab. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, David. Your work is so amazing. Any questions out there? I see one comment about hummingbird nests on conifer branches overhanging streams, and you mentioned that it might be for insects, or is it possible that it's for also protection from predators?
Yeah, that was my guess. Tree squirrels. Okay, we just don't have a lot of data. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of nests to work with, despite my posting at the beginning of the summer that I'll buy a free pint of third bowl ice cream for anybody who finds a hummingbird nest and lets me know where it is. Last year,
I'll go for
I
the
only
ice
learned
cream.
about one nest last summer.
Okay. Okay.
So this is
Christine,
Greg.
oops, sorry. Go on, Greg.
David, with the Rufus hummingbird, they seem to be flying thousands of miles in March and seem to get ahead of their resources. Do you see anything similar with broad-tailed hummingbirds where we might be more concerned about spring arrivals than the rest of the season in the States?
Well, we do get males arriving sometimes before there are flowers available. They come up right to the windows looking for the feeders that they probably saw last year. So they're at the leading edge of the green wave of vegetation and flowering. The females are a little bit behind that. In terms of the Rufus maybe outrunning the flowers, there's a graduate student, actually he's just finishing this month at Berkeley, one of Noah Whiteman's students, Nicholas Alexander, who's been looking at hummingbirds. He has the genomes of 500 of the broad-tailed hummingbirds that we've caught at the biological lab. And he's got some evidence that in California, there's been significant evolutionary change in the bill shape, the bill length of the hummingbirds, probably in response to the introduction of feeders in the 1950s. And so those feeders are providing a resource for the hummingbirds that allow them to perhaps outrun the wave of flowering as they proceed north or up in altitude.
It's amazing. I'm going to take one more question. And Christine, I know you had two, and I'll go with your first one. Christine Bishop wants to know if there are any new or invasive flowers infiltrating your plots.
Not in our plots, well, hardly ever in our plots. And unfortunately, we do have some invasive species. And there is one that hummingbirds will sometimes visit, which is the butter and eggs, or Linearia vulgaris, which is also a good resource for the native bumblebees. But we're lucky at this site that we don't have a lot of problem with invasive species.
Okay, thanks so much, David. And I know there are other questions. Do you want to share your email, or do you want us to take questions and send them to you?
I'll put it in the chat, and I'll also try and answer the questions in the chat.
Okay, sounds good. All right, thank you so much. And next up is Nancy Sheehan with Journey North. And for those of you who are aware, we've been working to, I'm trying to remove your spotlight here. We've been working to find a way to gather information about this phenology question, as well as to figure out other ways to track hummingbird migrations. Nancy is with Journey North, and so she's going to be here to talk more about that program and how it connects hummingbirds to their nectar resources. Thank you, Nancy.
Well, hello, everybody. Can you hear me fine? Yes, good. Well, David, you're a hard act to follow, and I think I'm going to have to take Susan up on her invite to your abode there in Colorado, and you can put me to work to do all the amazing research that you're doing. And I also want to say before I begin my formal presentation how much I have appreciated attending these meetings. So thank you so much to Susan and Greg and the rest of the team. These have been incredibly helpful and constructive conversations. So thank you so much. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen at this point. Should be able to see my screen. Yes?
Yes,
Thumbs
you're
up.
good.
Great. So as Susan mentioned, I'm Journey North. I go by the pronouns she, her, hers. I am the program coordinator of Journey North, and I'm very happy this morning to talk to you about tracking hummingbird migration with Journey North. I'm going to cover our mission, our monitoring approach, and some key program features. So Journey North is a crowdsourced, contributory, participatory science program that tracks wildlife migration and seasonal change. It was a nonprofit for many years. It actually was launched in 1993, really at the dawn of the internet, if some of us can actually remember that period of time before the internet existed, and was recently acquired by the University of Wisconsin-Madison Arboretum, and that was in 2018. So a rich history for Journey North. And like many citizen science and community science programs, the mission is really both awareness building, outreach, education, and also the collection of actionable data. So for our mission, really, it's to ignite interest in migratory species. We share the migration story and the amazing stories that these migratory species have to tell us all through various communication channels. And on the other hand, likewise, we're very much committed to contributing to the science of migration. So our monitoring approach, I guess I'll mention 3 here this morning to you, is since its inception, the Journey North founder director really wanted to create a program for the crowd, something that most people could participate in. So to do that, the Journey North species tracked are easily recognized species by the vast majority of people across North America. It is a continental program. It is across North America. So we invite people from Canada, US, Mexico, and beyond to participate. Again, it's a long history since 1993. And the focus is on the timing of phenological events. So briefly, I know that today we're all about hummingbirds, but I just wanted to mention that these recognizable species that Journey North we cover, many different species. So the hummingbird and our monarch and milkweed project are our 2 largest projects, but we also, our volunteers help us track common loons, barn swallows. We do have several educational programs that target educators and students working in classrooms. So the Hummingbird Project, our volunteers collect and submit reports for all the listed species here. The vast majority, I will say, of data submitted are for ruby-throated and rufous hummingbirds, but we do, and increasingly so, receive observational reports on all the other species. So as I mentioned, Journey North began in 1993. However, the Hummingbird Project was actually launched in 1996. So this is a map that shows the location of all the observational reports submitted to Journey North since 1996. We've had over 40,000 plus observers submitting 200,000 plus hummingbird observations. You can see that there's quite a concentration of reports east of the Rockies. I will say that that's completely understandable because initially in the early days, Journey North focus was on the ruby-throated hummingbird. So for several years, Journey North only accepted observational reports related to ruby-throated hummingbirds. Over time, this expanded, and since Journey North was acquired by the Arboretum here at UW, we've worked really hard to publicize and promote Journey North to accept various reports of hummingbirds across North America. So the focus again is on the timing of observable events in the annual life cycle of migratory animals and the resources they depend on. I should mention here that the Journey North data, we recommend that it's more for presence and absence type analyses and not for population density. I'll speak a little bit about the types of data we collect or we ask our volunteers to submit. But the data really we recommend is not useful for population density. So as you can imagine, the timing of events, we're very, very busy in the spring, just like our migratory species. We really ask our volunteers to let us know when they observe their first migrating hummingbird to breeding territories. We also ask our volunteers to submit information, for example, on when they place their feeder out in their backyards or balconies, what they are observing in terms of nectaring resources, you know, what species of plants are hummingbirds nectaring from. Spring kind of gradually moves into summer while we still accept first sightings. So for those first sightings, we limit it to one first sighting per volunteer per location. So we still have a few first sightings trickle into the summer months. But during the summer, we ask our volunteers really to report on behavioral observations. So defending territory, mating behavior. We continue to ask for information about what types of plants hummingbirds are feeding upon. We do ask in addition and receive some information, for example, on insects. I know David mentioned that about aquatic insects. We have volunteers also reporting some feeding behavior of insects. Of course, then we come to fall and winter, and fall and winter for Journey North is a little, it has been, the protocols have been a little bit tricky to fine tune. I would say that they're very different than the spring protocols. In the fall, we start through our communication channels prompting volunteers to let us know when they might be observing fall migratory behaviors like a feeding frenzy at a bird feeder, just to kind of begin to see when that first onset of fall migration begins. We also ask our volunteers to submit sightings for male hummingbirds, so male rufous hummingbirds, for example. And the idea here is also to, well, males are easier to identify, we have found, and also males are known to leave their breeding territory earlier than female and juveniles. So by asking volunteers to submit sighting of male hummingbirds, we're hoping to catch that wave of the first fall migrating hummingbirds. And for some of our volunteers who are keen observers of their own environments, their own backyards, they will be able to recognize a newly fall migrating hummingbird to their bird feeder, for example, or their garden, as opposed to the resident hummingbirds that they have observed all summer long. So this is just a quick schematic so that you could see that we really, the spring is all about firsts and nectaring behaviors. And then we continue to collect information about nectaring behaviors and other behaviors of hummingbirds. And then we move into this fall, trying to capture that fall migration behavior by targeting male hummingbird sightings and also specific kind of typical fall behavioral, migrating behavioral observations. So one of the hallmarks of our program, we have over 51 interactive maps. Our more popular ones are the spring migration maps. So this is just a quick GIF of the ruby-throated hummingbird spring migration map that where the map is populated by real-time data submitted by our volunteers. It's color-coded by the week, so you can see spring migration unfold in real time. And we have this for all of our project species. So Susan asked me in particular to highlight some of the data coming in regarding nectaring resources. So our volunteers actually, there's a field, a comment field, and our volunteers, some are quite eloquent, go into great detail about their gardens, their backyard gardens, or the place where they're observing hummingbirds. They'll put in information about whether they're native plants or non-native plants, what type of plant species that the hummingbirds are nectaring upon. They will also include some other features in the landscape. For example, pine, in this example here from Wisconsin, privet bushes, pine trees, and honey locust trees that offer perching sites or nesting sites for hummingbirds. So these narratives provide quite a context for where these observations are taking place and the types of habitat for hummingbirds. So our program's some key features I just wanted to mention this morning. Since Journey North, obviously, since its inception, has been really about making this program as accessible as possible to the crowd. So we offer an easy registration and reporting system. We again are very committed to telling the migration story, and we're committed to open access to the data collected by our volunteers. So to set up an account with Journey North is just basically to enter your name and address, set a password, and you can also subscribe to our e-newsletter at the time of registration. But then you're ready to submit your observations. So this is a quick screenshot of the data entry portal. Right now it's one page, data entry page here. We ask people to submit the date of their sighting, the location, the number of species they observed. They have the option, it's strongly encouraged, but it is optional to submit a photo and to write a comment that provides more context for any particular observation. Again, sharing that migration story, we're really committed to this. We produce about 150 e-newsletters. We have 42,000 email subscribers. And in these newsletters, we really rely on the comments that our volunteers provide us, in addition to these beautiful photos that they upload, to tell the migration story. So we feel very privileged to be able to amplify the voices of our volunteers and the data they are collecting through these newsletters. And of course, we're engaged in various social media channels. So open access to data is important while protecting privacy. Our volunteers or anyone really can go to our observational reporting web page, and you can key in on a tab here, view data, and up pops a table of the data that you're interested in, filtered by species and year or season. This here is just a quick screenshot of the loon first sighted data for 2022 in the spring. Our maps are another location where you can access the data submitted by our volunteers. Every location pin is interactive in the sense that you click a location pin and up pops the observational report. In this case, I have highlighted a report of a rufous in New York. This particular report has been creating quite a hubbub here amongst the Journey North team, and everybody's very excited about this hummingbird arriving late in New York, which is kind of unusual for rufous. So we've been communicating back and forth with this particular volunteer to make sure she accurately described and identified the species, and will continue to submit observations for this more rare sighting. I will indicate this little feature here, Contact Observer. Through this Contact Observer hyperlink, volunteer observers can actually contact other volunteer observers. It's all kind of a private chat feature for Journey North. And this creates a community where volunteers can support each other and help, perhaps in identifying correctly their species of interest. And it just is a nice community amongst the volunteers. Then with researchers in mind, I will say that for the last 2 years, I've been very fortunate to receive funding from the Environmental Data Initiative to host 2 summer fellows. We've worked very closely together to now publish all data sets associated with all the Journey North project species. So last summer, we published the Journey North Hummingbird data package to this central data repository. Of course, we have metadata documentation associated with that data package. We describe each of the fields in that data package as a DOI. There's information on how to download the data if you're interested in using R, Python, or what have you. So this really is part of my mission, really, to make sure that, and really a commitment to our volunteers to make sure that their data is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So we're meeting FAIR data principles. I think this is my last slide, but before I go into the very last slide, I didn't want to get too much into the future here. I have great hopes for Journey North. I'm just now undertaking a website redesign project. We're redesigning the database, and we're designing a mobile-friendly data submission application. And I say this only because this kind of conversation and these meetings are so helpful to me, because I want to make sure that Journey North is collecting the kind of information that is helpful to conserve and protect the hummingbirds that we all love, right? So I can only do that if I'm engaged in these kind of conversations to make sure that we're creating a database structure that we're collecting the kind of information that is useful, but at the same time, remaining true to our mission to involve many people in this effort of protecting and creating habitat for hummingbirds. So I think that is my last slide here.
Thank you so much, Nancy.
Of course, take questions, and I think my initial slide had my email, but I'm happy to, if you to email me or contact me that way too, happy to hear from you.
Great. Thanks so much, Nancy. We'll put that in the chat box then. And one of the reasons it's been great keeping in touch with Nancy and the wonderful work that she's been doing. And, you know, we're looking for a way to connect hummingbirds to their food. And there aren't any databases, well, aren't many that do that. So we worked with National Phenology Network to see if they could connect the information, and it just wasn't possible. And there just aren't many other databases that gather this information. So our challenge to all of you out there is to help us find a way that we can get this out for the West so we can make that map more populated and get more information that we need. Questions are, Greg has a question. Do your fall contributions begin early enough? Some of the Rufous and Calliope hummingbirds are showing up outside of their breeding range around July 4th.
So that's a great question, and I do struggle and would appreciate some input on the fall migration, our protocols for collecting fall migration data. We officially start fall August 1st, but that doesn't mean that we don't accept observations all along. So what that specific example might show up in maybe a more general observation of a hummingbird, a Rufous hummingbird, or Calliope hummingbird. But then we'd have to tease out through conversations with that volunteer or within the comment field right now. But our official fall starts August 1st.
Great, thanks, Nancy. And another Susan Ballinger is asking if there's any connection to eBird. Can your data be accessed from eBird, or is there any, I guess, connection between the two?
So again, eBird, folks at eBird can definitely download the Journey North data from that environmental data initiative data repository, so they're welcome to do so. I think it's very important for those of us who are managing these types of programs to work behind the scenes to connect our data sets as much as possible. I will say that I am the only staff member. I have one part-time programmer and one part-time person who looks at every single data report that comes in to validate and verify. So our ability to do some of that behind the scenes work is fairly limited, but it is a priority and would welcome discussions with eBird.
All right. Thank you again, Nancy, and we're looking forward to continuing to work with you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jacqueline. Jacqueline is with Foundations of Success, and as you know, she's been working with us quite a bit on this conservation planning process. So Jacqueline has the next part of the schedule.
Great, thanks, Sue. Did you want to do a quick break just before, or?
Yeah, I think we should do a quick break, but I would encourage all of you not to drop off, please. This is when we really get to work. I know the talks have been fascinating, and I hope they've informed the discussions that come, but we need you on this next hour. So if you could stick with us, that would be great. How long do you want to give them, Jacqueline?
So let's just do, it's 1 past the minute. So if we can do just a quick 4-minute break and be back at 5 after, whatever your time zone is. So 5 after the hour, just do a quick break and we'll jump back in and start looking at our kind of conservation threats and get some more work in small groups. So see you in 4 minutes, everyone.
Thanks.
working together after those great presentations. So either maybe put something in the chat or give a little thumbs up. I see some people are back. Feel free to let us know so we can get started. Okay, I see a few thumbs up. Great. Thanks, everyone. Okay, I will share my screen here. And you'll see a picture of me. I'll skip past that. As Susan mentioned, my name is Jacqueline, and I work for an organization called Foundations of Success. So we partner with other organizations and help to focus on strategic planning for typically species, ecosystems, everything under the sun. So we use a process. If you've been part of this before, you've heard of the conservation standards, and I will be very brief with this because, again, I want us to jump into the work. But we have done kind of this first step here. We've thought about, well, and we're still working on this. We've thought about some of the threats. We've developed what's called a situation model, which I'll show you. You saw some of that scope and vision and the conservation targets, right? The species of hummingbirds that we're focused on. And now we're starting to think about focusing on these conservation threats with a little bit more specificity. So we've looked at non-breeding ranges and breeding ranges, and today we're really focused on that migratory area. So as we have our discussions today, please keep that lens in your mind of when we're thinking about the biggest threats to these species and when we're thinking about actions and strategies to mitigate these threats. Let's think of it in the context of the migration region, that migratory route. And you saw some of those maps earlier. So that kind of moves us into that planning phase, right? Thinking about the end goals, the strategies, the objectives, and where we want to head with this conservation plan. Hopefully moving around with the implementation. I think a lot of you, in addition to research, it sounds like you do some of that implementation yourself. Always reflecting with that analyze and adapt, looking at the results, adapting the plans, which is going to be very important because just seeing the data that you all have presented, it's a changing time for many of these species, and then sharing that learning, which is already kind of one piece we're doing today, and something that I also want to thank you for being so absolutely engaged throughout this process. So again, just a quick glance at that. You can see there's a Spanish model as well, just we have both available. And then I will jump into the situation model just to give you all some context of what's already been developed and when we're thinking about some of the threats that have been drawn out and how to map our strategies. We have kind of a baseline of understanding of this context. This is not necessarily comprehensive. There's always more you can add to a model, which I'm sure many of you know, but this is meant to kind of highlight some of the largest threats, the largest contributing factors or drivers of those threats, and some of the environmental effects that we're seeing. So on the right-hand side here, you can see we have those different species of Western migrating hummingbirds. And then we called out some of the kind of largest biophysical effects that we're seeing. So what are the impacts on the environment that we're seeing? We're seeing things like loss of nesting sites, loss of insects, floral resources, and a lot of this is coming from these different habitat destruction activities that have been called out, habitat degradation activities. You can see there's even pretty direct losses of individuals with collisions, with hunting, entrapment, other pieces like that. And then something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about and seems especially relevant for this type of project and over such a large range is these climate change effects, right? So again, there's probably hundreds of climate change effects that you all are aware of, but trying to call out some of these specific ones. Throughout this process, which I'll also show you all, and if you've been a part of any of these discussions before, you've seen when we talk more specifically about the non-breeding area or the breeding area, there's also been more specific threats that have come out in the non-breeding area, which we recently discussed, even things such as certain illegal activities in drug trafficking, certain pieces of, trinkets or other things that are being used. So again, today we want to focus on what additional threats do we want to call out for the migration route. I won't list these off, but you can see over here on the left in orange, these are just some of the pieces that have been identified for what's driving these threats. So there's kind of an increased demand for locally grown food, rural development and industrial agriculture. We've talked about agriculture a lot throughout this process. Different fire suppression strategies, habitat removal, nursery practices. And then you can see leading to more of these direct losses of individuals, whether that's things like regulations for pane glass or domestic animal management, rodent control, other pieces like that. Okay, so this is our snapshot of what is going on. We want to, again, think of this snapshot in the context of the migration routes, and we'll start with that. And then we're going to really try and have some time to focus on what can we actually propose to mitigate and address these threats. So what are going to be some of the areas that the Western Hummingbird Partnership and you all can focus on in order to, again, increase the health of our target species. So any questions, or Sue or Greg, anything you want to add?
No, I think that sounds great.
Okay, I will wait. If you have any questions, please feel free. Okay. So we are going to move into, again, a bit more of an interactive piece of our workshop here. I know that many of you were in the Miro board previously. Please, at any point, I'll put the link back in the chat. Please, at any point, feel free to add resources to share, general questions or comments. It's great for us to have things in the chat, and we will make sure to save and document the chat. But this is also a really easy way for you all to interact with each other and for us to go back if you think of anything to add after today's workshop. So in here, we even have some of the resources from the last workshop that were shared just in the chat throughout the workshop session, and they're hyperlinked in here, which may be helpful. Okay, so what we're going to do today is move into, again, looking at the threats that have been identified so far and starting to think about whether or not there's any gaps in the threats that have been identified. When you think about the migration route, are there any specific pieces where threats are not being captured here? Let me put the link to this in the chat. I do want to encourage everyone to contribute verbally or in the chat as well. Otherwise, it's really easy to just grab one of these sticky notes and type directly in here. So we want to make any way that you can contribute a possibility. All right. So the link is in the chat here. You all are welcome to interact with it as I kind of walk through some of these different threats. Some that have been identified so far are this agricultural expansion. You can see below we have mining resource development. We have urban development, invasive non-native species, fire, managed and unmanaged, overgrazing, use of pesticides, collisions, entrapment, hunting, right? The list is getting pretty long here. So we do want to add in any gaps that we're seeing, but we'll also work in more of a threat rating system so that we can think about what the highest threats are, again, for migration areas specifically.
And Jacqueline, the only thing I want to do is help to define some of these topics or these threats. So for example, one that came up is, what do you mean by entrapment? And of course, we have a few things here. So one at the bottom, you'll see using hummingbirds for trinkets or jewelry, which also involves capturing hummingbirds or illegal wildlife use. Entrapment could also mean just passive entrapment, like a hummingbird gets into a place where it can't get out. It could be a garage, it could be a ski lift, any number of places that it could be. And then it could be, of course, more purposeful on the human end. If you feel like you need to tease out some of these threats, please do that now so that make sure we're not mixing threats. We tried to do that with entrapment a little bit. And I'm trying to think if there were any more that we wanted to discuss.
Maybe this yard open space field clearing. I know that's, if you were involved in the last discussion, that might seem a little odd.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good one. So what we're talking about there is, well, that's two things too. So you could look at it as an urban issue where people want, very clean yard, and they take out some of that diversity of plants in the structure that birds need. It can also refer to clearing as a forest management tool. For example, if we're clearing underbrush for fire or taking away some of that vegetation, which could include flowering plants or other plants that hummingbirds need. So just any kind of cleaning up of the I guess the environment, whether it's urban or human made, or if it's natural. And you can ask if you have any questions about these, or put it in the chat box too.
Great. So we're happy. I see maybe some specificity that's coming out of this. I think even if it's not a new threat, if you want to add any specificity on this board, just so that it's captured, that's always helpful. So I know we've talked about kind of this monoculture with agave and avocado. So we can make sure that that's being that's on your minds with the agricultural expansion and unsustainable practices. I see a comment over here that's over dependence on suburban gardens. If someone feels comfortable, I guess it says in here, due to loss of small natural area for stopovers on migration. If anyone wants to comment on that, or kind of what that's leading to, please feel free to hop off chat or off mute. Okay, I see some more typing going on in there. Great, I see declines in insect populations. And some of these are called out as some of those biophysical factors, but it may be something where we say maybe it needs to be elevated to a higher level that we rate it. So I see in here the mismatch of floral phenology. I think that's probably an important one after our conversations today that we might actually want to be rating as a threat. So thanks to whoever is adding that in right now. lack of resources I see, and that's probably driving a lot of different threats here. Anything people want to share out loud? Otherwise, we'll add what we can and get into groups. I see this lack of interest from the governments. So that's probably driving, again, some of these, I think we have in here. I thought we had some policy, but maybe that's something we need to add. Natural drying out of meadows. Okay, I can add that for some of our climate work. Great. Invasive species due to illegal logging. So thanks for adding, again, one of the contributing factors to what's leading to those invasive species. Perfect. Great. And I see disease in there. So I'm going to move that down here just so it's kind of grouped with what we have. And Sarah E., so without a doubt, the lack of food, the strong climatic and biophysical changes. Perfect. So let's make sure those are getting represented as we do our threat rating. So a lot of these, I think, are details of our threats here, which is extremely helpful because as we come back to work on the plan, we want to, again, know what's contributing to each of these threats. Is there anything, though, that we want to add to our actual threat rating here so that when we go through and rate the threats, we can see how it's stacking up against other direct threats that we have? I know I had suggested climate change, the phenology, bringing it from a biophysical factor like we have in our situation model to a threat that we would rank.
Yeah, and again, just to remember that we're looking at migration. So any information or any threats as they're journeying, as they're traveling.
Can people give some agreement, or I guess maybe a better way is, does anyone disagree that we should not raise the phenology suggestion that we're getting up to a threat that we should rate in our small groups here? I'm seeing some agreement.
Okay, we have one agree it should be raised.
And if you don't think it's a high threat for any of these, that'll be your opportunity when we jump into groups here. You each have your name at the top. I double checked a few minutes ago to make sure everyone is up there, but if for some reason you can't find your name, just reach out and I'll make a space for you. And then we will, you guys will be rating whether each of these threats are a low, medium, high, or very high threat. Again, keeping in mind that this is for the migration route. So these have been identified for hummingbirds in general. And now we want to think for the migration route, how severe and what is the scope and how irreversible. So these different threat rating criteria. If you think about those three criteria, how high is the threat? Okay. Again, low is 1 and 4 is very high. We know that these are all important in some way, but for the migratory route, how would you rate these? Declining snowfall. Okay, great. I'm gonna add that, David, to the board here. And all of this information, like I said, is really important, especially for developing the plan here. But is there anything we want to elevate to be rated right now? Okay, let's start with what we have. I will keep some of these sticky notes in here. And so at any point in your discussions with your groups, if you have more details to add, put them in the chat or create a sticky note so we can come back to this information. I want to remind you guys that if you don't document something, we don't know it was in your mind. So please, if you have any thoughts that you want us to come back to, since I know we have a short amount of time together, please make sure it gets documented in the chat or in the mural board. Okay, Susan, I know we have some breakout groups set. So what we're going to do is send you off into breakout groups. If you all can individually spend just about 5 minutes, it shouldn't take that much time to go through this list over here. It's in English and Spanish. Use the different criteria of, again, kind of scope. So how much of this target, how many and how much of the hummingbird species will be affected, how severe, what's the level of damage, and how irreversible will that damage be. If you can think of those different pieces and go through the list here on the left-hand side, under your name, you're just going to put a 1, 2, 3, or 4. You'll see it do this, and it'll start auto-populating an average. So you can just go through, and again, red is higher severity.
Okay.
Any final questions?
For the breakout rooms, you do have a Western Hummingbird Partnership representative in each room who will help. So Vicki Finn, Sari, Christine Bishop, please help guide those groups. And so if you have any questions or are unsure about the process, you can ask them in the groups. Jacqueline, are you ready for me to move them in?
Ready, and I just put the link in the chat, but I will also broadcast it, or hopefully someone in your group has it. Feel free to click on that and you'll be swooped away into a group. Please join that group. And after you spend the first 5 minutes doing your individual threat rating, please feel free. We want you to be in a small group so you can have some discussion, ask each other questions, and we'll look across different individuals for agreement.
All right, great. So here you go into your rooms.
And it looks like we have one person who maybe needs to be assigned.
Oh, Erin. Okay.